So manifestos, film or otherwise, can be in the first instance understood as ways of calling into being new ways of living and thinking about the ways in which society, politics, and aesthetics ought to work. Now, one of the reasons that there's limitations to this is that many of these manifestos, political, aesthetic, or a combination of the two, attempt to do this in really radical ways that try to destabilize society, politics, and culture. Now, the first film we're seeing tonight comes from the futurist tradition, and futurism is quite interesting in terms of cinema, because futurism, as many of you know, is about the rapid industrialization and mechanization of society, and that being a very good thing, a very male thing, a very driven thing. War and technology are looked upon as being things that are going to be transformative in culture and society. And it's worth to briefly look at the Futurist Manifesto on cinema in that light. So you'll be happy to know I'm not going to read these manifestos in detail, but just brief excerpts. So, and I should say, in the spirit of transparency, this is the first time I've ever used glasses in a public venue. So, yeah. So technology. Wow. Yeah. Okay. So, at first look, the cinema, born only a few years ago, may seem to be futurist already, lacking a past and free from traditions. Actually, by appearing in the guise of theater without words, it has inherited all the most traditional sweepings of literary theater. Consequently, everything we have said and done about the stage, futurist in this case, applies to the cinema. Our action is legitimate and necessary insofar as the cinema up to now has been and tends to remain profoundly passéiste, whereas we see it the possibility of an eminently futurist art and the expressive medium most adapted to the complex sensibility of a futurist artist. It would be wrong to think of the manifestos and films that surround them as being products that are divorced or distantiated from real-world events, and especially the crises that were going on both politically and aesthetically and in between these two categories in Europe in the 1920s. Most profoundly, the impact of the First World War in Europe, as many or all of you know, profoundly influenced the avant-gardes, especially those coming out of France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Dadaism believed in the notion of irrationality, infantilism, and play as means by which to reinvigorate an aesthetic and political consciousness, since the precepts of rationality and logic and realism had obviously let the side down and led to massive destruction. In the Manifesto exhibition, one of the channels, which is the first one after the introduction, Kate Blanchett plays a homeless man decrying situationist manifestos, including Du Bois' situationist manifesto from 1960. And so one of the things that's often lost in the work of Du Bois is the fact that the cinema, and indeed once he comes up with the concept of the spectacle first articulated in the film we're going to see tonight, that the cinema was at the center of his notion of both the positive and negative aspects of the way in which artistic and then political culture could be engaged in.
I didn't think such a place existed except in my own imagination. It has a ghastly familiarity, like a half-remembered dream. Anything could happen here. Any moment.
Le temps de la production, le temps marchandise, est une accumulation infinie d'intervalles équivalents. C'est l'abstraction du temps irréversible, dont tous les segments doivent prouver sur le chronomètre leur seule égalité quantitative. Ce temps est, dans toute sa réalité effective, ce qu'il est dans son caractère échangeable. Le temps général du non-développement humain existe aussi sous l'aspect complémentaire d'un temps consommable, qui retourne vers la vie quotidienne de la société, à partir de cette production déterminée, comme un temps pseudo-cyclique.
Du Bois is at this intersection of French philosophy, of critical Marxism and semiotics at the time, and his film work is really a missing link in that. It's often not considered or understood. Most profoundly, perhaps, because he pulled all his films from circulation after the murder of his of the person who was funding his films, Gerard Lebovici, after Lebovici bought him a movie theater in an arrondissement in Paris that showed his films, and only his films, 7 days a week. Attendance was low. Capitalism was not the goal. All right, so at the same time as the Situationists, other movements, both in Europe and the United States and globally, were engaging in ways to think about the question of play as being central to avant-garde aesthetics and politics. Play, the notion of play, is certainly central to the Situationists, and the idea that play should be what people strive for instead of work. And we also see that notion of play, though, articulated and manifested in a different way in the work of Fluxus. Fluxus's leader, for lack of a better term, was George Mancunius, who was an American artist of Greek descent, who surrounded himself, was influenced by John Cage and other artists in the United States at the time, especially in music, that were interested in the notion of allegoric art, or art generated by chance. And Mackenzie developed a network of artists around him, including Yoko Ono, who started off doing avant-garde work in Japan, and then immigrated to the United States and made her first films. Ono is often overshadowed because she was married to John Lennon, but probably one of the most important experimental and conceptual filmmakers in the 1960s and early 1970s. She was very much part of the Fluxus movement, and the next film we're going to see is incredibly short, but its shortness does not at all take away from its importance. And one of the other manifestos that's present in the Manifesto exhibition is one from pop art. Pop art is often thought about as perhaps the best known of the 60s avant-garde movements because of Warhol, soup cans, and what have you. But other artists, other experimental artists who precede Warhol in experimental or avant-garde or American underground cinema were deeply ensconced in both popular culture and turning popular culture on its head. And one of those filmmakers was Kenneth Anger. Now, Kenneth Anger made his first film in 1947 while his family was away on holiday. It's best known for S&M scenes with 17-year-old Anger and a sailor, but probably even better known for the first known representation of a Christmas tree that ejaculates fireworks, hence the title of the film, Fireworks. It's a great work. Amazing the 17-year-old in the 1940s was making it. And Anger was, by his own definition, a queer Satanist, or rather a disciple of Aleister Crowley. And in the film we're going to see tonight, he fuses his political and aesthetic interest in the ways in which homoeroticism can be portrayed with his strong sense of popular culture and his own belief that popular culture itself was, again, a word I can never pronounce in English. And English is my first language, so I should be able to do this. But anyways, Dionysian, and using pop ballads from the 1950s and early 1960s to undercut their innocence and turn them into something that is far more sexualized, which in many ways makes perfect sense, as these songs, despite the fact at times they seem anodyne, were very much about teenagers discovering their own straight and queer and polymorphous sexuality.
Don't know how, I hope you'll hear my plea. Some way, I don't know how, he'll bring his love to me. Dream lover, until then, I'll be a sleeper and dream again. That's the only thing to do until my lover's dreams come true. Because I want you call my own. I want a dream lover, so I don't have to dream alone. I want a dream lover, so I don't have to dream alone.
A major influence on De Boer was de Lautréamont, who famously wrote, "Plagiarism is necessary, progress implies it. It holds tight an author's phrase, uses his expressions, eliminates a false idea, and replaces it with just the right idea." So this notion of appropriation, which was central to De Boer and is central to Jim Jarmusch, who also has a manifesto in the film Manifesto in the exhibition, and central to many other experimental and avant-garde filmmakers who wrote manifestos and made films. This notion of stealing is very important. So looking at the Jarmusch Manifesto, which basically says everyone should steal shit, use it the ways in which they want to, create something new with it, it's ethical and good, we're going to watch a little scene film made by a Canadian named Arthur Lipsett.
I think I know now.
Well, if you're interested in truth, you know, I mean, it sort of makes you pause, because this way you can't know anything.
You can't.
Well, depends what you mean, but do you ever get, I mean, you're shaped from birth, you know, by everything around you. You can't really prove me. Convictions, but there's the same testing. They're not so quite defined.
Warmth and brightness will return, and renewal of the hopes of men.
Bravo. Very nice, very nice.
in many ways, von Trier is the key person who repopularized the notion of film manifestos in the late 1990s. Now, his first film, few manifestos, did not have a great impact, perhaps because, in one of them he writes in caps, "I'm the great masturbator of the silver screen," and no one wanted to know that. But with Dogma 95, at the centenary of cinema in 1995, he created a manifesto with Thomas Vinterberg that not only gained a great deal of press coverage, but also led to some very important films, including Vinterberg's film, the first Dogma Film Fest in 1999. Von Trier went on to write other manifestos. Indeed, for most of his films he writes manifestos, but one of the most interesting ones in terms of the ways in which we only talked about really at the beginning tonight, that rule following is central to manifestos, is the film he made with Jürgen Leith, the Danish documentary filmmaker, called The Five Obstructions. And in that film, he took what von Trier thought was the perfect film, Leith's The Perfect Human from 1967, a short ethnographic, quasi-fictional documentary, and challenged him to remake it following von Trier's own edicts, 5 different ways. So it's an animated film, a film shot in the poorest part of the world, a film shot in Cuba, what have you. Each attempt, an attempt to break Leith in some way from the limitations that von Trier thought that he had. At the end of the film, the 5th obstruction, the 5th way that Leith has to remake his perfect film, is by reading a monologue written by von Trier, but written by von Trier in Leith's voice. So as if written by Jürgen Leith, which Leith then has to read. It's called Dear Stupid Lars.
Kære Lars, tak for benspændene. De har lært mig at se, hvad jeg egentlig er. Et usselt, menneskeligt menneske. Jeg forsøger, som menneskene gør det, at narre verden og mig selv, fordi jeg ikke vil være ved det. Mit knep er billigt, og jeg gentager det i det uendelige. Og du fik mig til at spille med, men gjorde den fejl at lade mig komme i defensiven. Og som vi alle ved, er det angriberen, der virkelig får udstillet sig selv. Sådan er det. Du tog fejl. Og det var mig, der spændte ben for dig, hvor meget du end ønskede det omvendt. Og du faldt så langt du var. Hvordan falder det perfekte menneske? Sådan falder det perfekte menneske.
If one's going to talk of manifestos, then one almost inevitably has to go back to good old Karl Marx, who was, unlike I thought in elementary school, not one of the Marx brothers. It's sad, but it's true. I've come a long way. But in his posthumously published thesis on Feuerbach, the 11th diktat of that, the 11th point of the manifesto is probably the most important for film manifestos and also, I would think, for the contemporary political context. And many of you probably know this quite well, but I'd like to finish with it. It's very, 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 very short, which is thesis number 11. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And I think that that's a critical and philosophical, but also activist point of view that's probably more relevant now than the over 130 years ago when it was first written. That aesthetic works, political works, creative works, communicative works are about changing the world, not simply about expressing one's at times masculineness, but also privileged in other ways, solitary vision of the world, but instead of using art as a way to radically destabilize default assumptions of the way in which the world is, and to educate people that not simply that there's this other way the world should be, so you should follow this, but that everything is open to question, everything can be challenged, and everything can be reimagined. Thank you.